The scan came back wrong, and vessel clerk Orun refused to believe it twice. He read the number again. He read it a third time. The display floated above his work shell in clean violet script, the way every entry in the Great Index had appeared for the 11,000 years his order had kept it, and the number it gave him for the lone contact drifting at the edge of the Threll outpost made no sense at all. Mass: 11 million tons. Length: 4.1 kilometers. Power signature: a flat line where there should have been a curve. A flat line meant a dead hull. A dead hull did not hold position against the pull of a gas giant. This one did. He had logged 10,000 dead hulls in his 400 years. He knew the way a wreck behaved. A wreck tumbled. A wreck drifted with the local pull. Its mass surrendered to the larger thing nearby, its dead bones turning slowly end over end as the gas giant reeled it in. That was the whole character of a wreck. It had stopped arguing with the universe. This contact was not tumbling. It was not drifting. It sat in the violet dark with its prow level, and its station perfect, holding itself against a pull that should have been dragging it down into the cloud tops, and it did this with a power signature that swore, in clean instrument language, that nothing aboard it was running at all. Either his instrument was lying, or a dead thing was holding its breath. "Rerun it," Orun said to the cataloging array. His voice was dry and exact, the voice of someone whose entire life was the recording of things. "The instrument is faulty." The array reran it. The instrument was not faulty. The number did not change. Around him, the index hall stretched away into soft violet gloom, tier upon tier of work shells, where his fellow clerks logged the comings and goings of the Threll Concordance, every freighter, every courier, every survey drone that crossed this quiet rim of settled space. The Concordance did not fight wars. The Concordance filed them. It had outlived 9 empires by the simple method of writing everything down and waiting for the loud ones to destroy themselves. Orun had spent 400 years adding lines to that long, patient ledger, and in 400 years, he had never once felt his hands go cold over a single entry. His hands were cold now. "Origin?" he asked. "No origin on record," the array answered. "Class?" "No class on record." "Registry, builder, flag, prior sighting, hull family, drive type, anything?" "No record." "No record, no record." Orun sat very still. In the Great Index, there was a record for everything. That was the entire point of the Great Index. A thing without a record was not a mystery to the Concordance. It was an error, a smudge, a clerical fault to be cleaned up and filed under nuisance. The Concordance had a saying, drilled into every clerk in his first decade of service. If it moves, it has a maker. If it has a maker, it has a beginning. If it has a beginning, it is already in the ledger, and you have simply not looked hard enough. Orun had lived by that saying for 400 years. It had never once failed him. He had traced freighters back to forgotten yards, couriers back to dead flags, derelicts back to wars no living thing remembered. And always, always, the ledger had held the thread, because the ledger held everything. To look hard enough was the whole of his craft. He looked as hard as he had ever looked in his life. There was no thread, there was no maker, no beginning, no flag, no yard. The contact had crossed into cataloged space, the way a word appears on a blank page. From nowhere the page could account for. So Orun did what 11,000 years of doctrine told him to do. He opened a fresh entry, assigned the contact a provisional tag, and began the process of cataloging it into harmlessness. He labeled it Object 9 Null. He set its threat tier to the lowest band, the band reserved for drifting wrecks and abandoned mining platforms, because a flat power signature could mean nothing else. He wrote, in the calm violet script, the word that would let the outpost sleep easy tonight, harmless. Then the flat line moved. It did not spike. That was the part that would stay with him. A weapon charging spikes, an engine lighting spikes, a reactor failing spikes. This did none of those things. The flat line simply slid sideways across his display, smooth as a finger drawn through dust, and Object 9 Null changed its position by 900 kilometers in the time it took Orun to draw one breath. "That is not possible," he said. "It is recorded," the array answered, because the array did not care what was possible. It only cared what had happened, and what had happened was that an 11 million-ton object with no engine output had crossed 900 kilometers in under 2 seconds and was now closer to the outpost than it had been. Orun's training took over before his fear could. He raised the threat Tier 1 band. He flagged the entry for a senior overseer. He pulled the optical feed, because numbers could lie but light could not, and for the first time, he saw the thing his array had been trying to tell him about. It filled the feed, not gracefully, not like the sleek courier hulls the Concordance favored, all smooth curves and polite running lights. This was a slab, a long, dark, brutal wedge of metal that seemed to have been beaten into shape rather than grown, its flanks layered with armor plating that overlapped like the scales of some old reptile, its surface broken by 10,000 small hard shapes that Orun's catalog could not name. Towers, batteries, sensor masts, things that jutted and bristled. The hull was scarred. Long pale streaks ran down its sides where something had struck it and failed to get through, and the scars were not hidden or repaired, but simply left there, as if the ship wore them on purpose, as if it wanted anyone who looked to understand exactly how many times it had been hit and how little that had mattered. It was old. He could see that even through the feed, the kind of old that meant a thing had been used, hard, for a very long time, and had not broken. He widened the scan to the full optical band, the way he did for any contact he could not place, and what came back made the cold in his hands climb to his throat. The hull was not only scarred, it was layered. Beneath the outermost plating he could see older plating, and beneath that, older still, generation upon generation of armor, welded over armor, the way a very old tree carries its young rings buried at its heart. The ship had been rebuilt, and rebuilt, and rebuilt again. Never replaced, never retired, each repair laid over the last, so that the 4-kilometer slab in his feed was not a single ship at all, but the accumulated body of every battle it had ever survived, carried forward in metal. A Concordance vessel that took damage was scrapped and refiled. This thing had been kept. Someone had decided, 4 centuries ago and every year since, that it was worth keeping, and the keeping was written all over it in welds. There was a name on the prow. The optical feed caught it in a low band of light. The letters were not Concordance letters, and the array could not read them, but Orun copied the shape of them into his entry, because that was his discipline, and the shape of them looked like this: St. Aldridge. He had no idea what a St. Aldridge was. He filed the question for later. He had a more pressing line to write. It was a strange thing to put on a hull. The Concordance named its vessels by registry and function: Cutter 41, Survey Drone 6, Holding Yard Tender, because a name was a handle, and a handle existed to make filing easier. No clerk had ever met a fleet that named its warships after words, after ideas, after things that could not be assigned a registry. To paint a word on a 4-kilometer prow, where it would be the first and last thing any onlooker saw, was to say something about what the ship was for. Orun did not yet know what it said. He only knew that the saying of it had been deliberate, and that a people who painted words on warships were a people who wanted to be read. The outpost's defense net had noticed the contact now. Across the index hall, work shells brightened as clerks woke to the same impossible numbers Orun was staring at. A senior overseer's sigil bloomed in the air beside him, and the overseer's voice came through clipped and certain, the voice of authority that had not yet understood that today would be different. Clerk Orun, you raised a threat flag on a drifting wreck. It is not drifting, Overseer Saul, Orun said. It is holding station, and it just moved. Wrecks do not move. This one did. 900 kilometers, no drive signature. A pause. Orun could imagine Saul pulling the same feed, reading the same flat line, feeling the same small cold thing crawl up the back of the neck. When the overseer spoke again, the certainty had thinned, just slightly, like a coat of paint over rot. Hail it, Saul said. Standard Concordance contact protocol. Tell it that it is in cataloged space, and must identify itself for the index. If it is a wreck, there will be no answer, and we will tow it and be done. If there is a crew aboard, they will answer, and we will file them, and we will be done. Either way it is filed, and either way we are done. Either way we are done, Orun thought. He almost wrote it into the entry. He did not. Because clerks of the Great Index did not record what they felt, only what occurred, and he was suddenly and absolutely certain that what was about to occur would need every line he could give it. The outpost sent the hail. It went out on every band the concordance used, a polite and ancient demand wrapped in 11,000 years of bureaucratic confidence. Identify yourself. Submit your registry. You are in cataloged space. For 11 seconds, nothing. Orun counted them. He always counted. 11 seconds, in which the slab hung there in the violet dark, scarred and silent, and the outpost waited for a dead hull to confirm that it was dead. Then the answer came back, and it was not a registry, and it was not a flag, and it was not the silence of a wreck. It was a voice. A calm voice, level and unhurried, speaking in the concordance's own trade tongue, with an accent the array had no file for, and it said only this. This is the warship St. Aldridge of the Terran Reach. We received your message. We are reading it now. Orun's hands hovered over his work shell. We are reading it now, the voice had said. Not we acknowledge, not we comply. We are reading it, as if the great and patient concordance, the order that filed empires and outlived gods, had just sent a letter to a stranger, and the stranger had opened it and was deciding what to think. Overseer, Orun said quietly. It answered. I heard. Saul's voice had lost a little more of its paint. Terran Reach. Cross-reference the term. Orun cross-referenced the term. The Great Index, the ledger of everything, the memory of the settled galaxy, returned its answer in clean violet script, and the answer was the second wrong thing Orun would see that day. No record, no record, no record. There is nothing, Overseer, he said. The Index has never heard of them. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence, not the silence of a wreck, the silence of a great machine, 11,000 years old, encountering for the first time a thing it had not already written down. On the feed, the warship St. Aldridge slid forward another 900 kilometers, smooth and silent and scarred, and its flat dead power signature did not so much as flicker, and Orun understood, with the cold, clean certainty of a man who has logged 10,000 wrecks and never once seen one do this, that the flat line was not a dead reactor at all. It was a thing pretending to be dead. It was a thing that had decided, for reasons no entry in the Great Index could yet explain, to let them think it was harmless, right up until the moment it chose not to. He looked at the word he had written in the entry not 10 minutes before. The calm violet word meant, to let the outpost sleep. Harmless. He reached out, with a hand he could not quite hold steady, and he deleted it. He did not replace it with anything. He had nothing to replace it with. The Great Index, for the first time in his 400 years of service, had run out of words. Far across the violet dark, the warship that should not exist read their ancient demand to its end, considered it, and began, without hurry, to close the distance. Overseer Saul arrived in the Index Hall in person, which had not happened in Orun's memory, and the first thing the Overseer did was demand that the entry be closed. File it and tow it, Saul said. He stood over Orun's work shell, tall and pale and certain, the silver thread of his rank woven through his robe. One ship, one. We have logged armadas, clerk. We logged the Vesh war fleet, 14,000 hulls, and we filed it in an afternoon. We do not lose our composure over a single scarred relic that does not even register a reactor. It crossed 1,800 kilometers in 4 seconds, Orun said, twice, with no drive signature. Then the instrument is wrong. The instrument is the same instrument that logged the Vesh war fleet, Overseer. That landed. Saul's jaw tightened. He did not like to be reminded that the tools of the Great Index were either reliable or they were not, and that he could not have it both ways. He turned to the optical feed instead, where the warship St. Aldridge hung scarred and patient against the gas giant's banded light, and he studied it with the particular contempt of a creature that had spent its whole life filing larger things. Look at it, Saul said. It is filthy. The hull is unpainted. There is corrosion on the lower plating. The concordance would not let a vessel in that condition dock at a rim outpost, let alone cross settled space. Whatever these Terrans are, they are poor, and they are crude, and they do not maintain their machines. He almost smiled. A people who cannot keep their own hull clean are not a people who frighten the Index. Orun looked at the corrosion Saul was pointing to. He looked at the long pale scars that ran the length of the hull, and a small, careful, 400-year-old part of his mind noticed something that the overseer's contempt had skipped right over. The corrosion was only on the lower plating, the scars were everywhere, and a ship that had been struck that many times, in that many places, by that many things, and was still here, still holding station, still answering hails in a calm and level voice, was not a ship that had failed to maintain itself. It was a ship that had simply decided that paint did not matter, because nothing that had ever shot at it had lived long enough to care what color it was. "Overseer," Orun said slowly, "I do not think the dirt means what you think it means." Saul was not listening. He had already turned to the hall's senior communications shell, and he was composing, in his own hand, a formal concordance demand, the kind the index sent to small powers that wandered into cataloged space without filing first. Orun could see it forming in the violet script. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic confidence. It informed the warship St. Aldridge that it was in space administered by the Threll Concordance, under the 11,000-year accord, that its presence was unregistered, and therefore unlawful, that it was to power down its drive. Orun noted, with quiet dread, that they were ordering it to power down a drive that gave off no signature at all, and submit to inspection, boarding, and entry into the Great Index, after which it would be towed to a holding yard and held pending fees. Pending fees, the Concordance was going to fine the warship that should not exist for the crime of existing without paperwork. Orun had read 10,000 such demands across his service, had drafted hundreds himself, and he had always thought of them as the gentlest of the order's tools, a letter rather than a lance. It was only now, watching one go out to a thing the index could not file, that he understood how the demand must read to a stranger. It did not ask, it did not negotiate. It informed a 4-kilometer warship, scarred by enemies the Concordance had never heard of, that it was a clerical irregularity, and that the cure for being a clerical irregularity was to surrender. There was an arrogance in it so old and so deep that the Concordance no longer felt it as arrogance at all. It felt like simple fact. The index filed, therefore the index was owed. "Send it," Saul said. The communications clerk hesitated. "Overseer," it raised its threat tier on its own approach. Perhaps a softer. "Send it. We are the index. We do not soften." They sent it. The answer took 9 seconds this time. Orun counted. When it came, it was the same calm voice, the same level unhurried tone, and it did not argue with a single word of the demand. It did not protest the fees, it did not dispute the accord, it said only, "We understand your message. We don't recognize your authority over this space, but we understand it. Be advised that we are not here for you. We're passing through. We'd prefer to keep passing through. We're telling you that as a courtesy." The word courtesy hung in the index hall like a held breath. Saul's pale face went a shade paler, then flushed. "A courtesy," he repeated. "It offers the Concordance a courtesy. It." He rounded on the communications shell. "Tell it that the Concordance does not accept courtesies from unregistered vessels. Tell it that if it does not power down within the hour, the Rim Defense Squadron will compel it." Orun looked up sharply. "Overseer, the Rim Squadron is 40 ships. We have not confirmed what that one ship can do." 40 Concordance cutters against one scarred relic with a dead reactor, Saul said. "I will take that file, clerk. I will file it gladly." He leaned close, and his voice dropped to something almost gentle, almost paternal. "You are afraid because the index has no record of them. I understand. An empty entry is the most frightening thing a clerk can see. But an empty entry does not mean a thing is powerful, Orun. It means a thing is new, and new things are small. Always. That is the lesson of 11,000 years. The index has filed every power that ever called itself great, and every single one of them began as an empty entry, and every single one of them was small once. We caught them when they were small. We will catch this one too." It was, Orun would think later, a beautiful argument. It was logical, it was historical, it was exactly the kind of thing the Great Index existed to believe. And it was wrong, in one precise and fatal way, which was that it assumed the warship St. Aldridge had wandered in small and recent, and unaware of its own weight. It had not wandered in, it had arrived. There was a difference, and Orun had spent 400 years learning to feel it in the numbers. A thing that wandered, did not hold perfect station against a gas giant. A thing that wandered did not cross 900 kilometers in a single breath and then stop, exactly where it meant to be. A thing that wandered did not answer an ancient demand by saying we are reading it now, as if it had all the time in the world and was spending it on the concordance only out of politeness. Everything about the warship's behavior said the opposite of wandering. It said deliberation. It said a thing that knew precisely what it was and precisely where it was, and had simply chosen, for the moment, to be still. The Rim Defense Squadron formed up over the next 40 minutes, and Orun logged every ship of it, because that was his discipline, and because some cold instinct told him these entries would matter. 40 concordance cutters, sleek and clean and freshly painted, their hulls the pale gray-violet of the Order, their running lights bright and orderly. Each one carried a particle lance and a complement of interceptors. Together, they had ended 3 Rim insurrections without losing a single hull. They were not a great fleet. They did not need to be. They were the polite, well-maintained, perfectly catalogued violence of an order that had never in 11,000 years met a thing it could not eventually outweight. He logged their names as they checked in, one after another, crisp and confident on the open band, and there was a terrible ordinariness to it that Orun would remember long after. These were not heroes. They were clerks of a different kind, officers who filed insurrections the way Orun filed freighters, certain of their tools, certain of their order, certain that the universe could be made to submit to a well-drilled maneuver. He listened to them check in, and he wanted, suddenly and uselessly, to tell every one of them to stay home. They spread into the standard englobement, the slow tightening net the concordance used to compel a stubborn vessel without destroying it, because the index always preferred to file a thing intact. 40 cutters drew a wide, patient sphere around the single scarred warship, and the squadron commander sent the final demand, and the warship St. Aldridge answered it in the same calm voice it had used for everything. Last courtesy, it said. We see 40 of you. We'd ask you to move. You won't, because you don't believe us yet. So we're going to show you something small, and we're going to do it carefully, because we don't actually want to kill anyone today. Watch the freighter. There was an old derelict freighter in the holding yard near the outpost, a concordance hulk being slowly stripped for parts, catalogued and tagged and forgotten, the kind of dead thing Orun filed a dozen of in a slow month. It hung at the edge of the optical feed, dark and inert, exactly the kind of harmless object Orun had nearly labeled the St. Aldridge as. He even knew its entry number. He had logged it himself, 2 seasons ago, when the salvage crews tagged it for stripping. Hulk 317, 11,000 tons. Threat tier, none. The warship did not appear to do anything. There was no flash, no charging signature, no beam. The flat dead power line on Orun's display did not so much as twitch, and the derelict freighter, 11,000 tons of catalog junk, came apart. Not exploded, came apart. It unmade itself, hull plate by hull plate, in a single silent instant, peeling into a slow expanding cloud of fragments so fine that Orun's array struggled to track them. One moment a ship, the next, a glittering haze where a ship had been, drifting outward in a perfect sphere, every piece smaller than a clerk's hand. The index hall was utterly silent. Orun stared at his readout. His instruments had registered the freighter's death down to the gram. They had not registered a single joule of energy from the St. Aldridge to cause it. Whatever the warship had done it with a method the Great Index had no file for, no name for, no entry for at all, and it had done it gently, almost kindly, on a thing that no one would miss, precisely so that 40 proud cutters could watch a dead ship turn to dust and understand, in their bodies, what was about to happen to them if they did not move. Orun did the only thing he knew how to do with a thing he could not understand. He opened the entry for Hulk 317, with the one he had written himself 2 seasons ago, and beside the threat tier he had marked none, he added a single line, and the line was the most honest thing he had written all day. He wrote, "Deleted, by demonstration, as a courtesy to the living." "Overseer," Orun said quietly, "it is asking us to move. It is still asking." Saul did not answer. Saul was staring at the glittering cloud where a freighter had been, and the certainty had finally, fully drained from his face, and what was left there was the oldest expression in the catalog, Older than the concordance, older than the index. The expression every species wore the first time it met a thing that did not fit in its files. The squadron commander broke the silence. His voice came over the open band, tight and proud and trembling at the edges. He was a concordance officer. He had ended 3 insurrections. He had never run from anything in his life, and he was not going to start with one filthy scarred relic that did not even show a reactor, no matter what it had just done to a hulk. Unregistered vessel, the commander said. That was a violation of the accord. You have destroyed concordance property. You are now subject to compulsion. Power down or be fired upon. There was a pause. When the warship answered, for the first time, the calm voice carried something underneath it. Not anger, not fear. Something closer to regret. The regret of a thing that had offered a courtesy 3 times and watched it refused 3 times. You're going to fire, the warship said. I can hear it in your voice. I've heard that voice a lot of times, across a lot of years, in a lot of languages. So I'm going to tell you the truth now, because you've earned that much. My name is Saint Aldridge. I am 412 years old. I have been shot at by the Karzon Hive, by the Velt machine mines, by 3 separate species that thought their numbers would matter, and by one entity so old it had forgotten its own name. None of them are filing reports anymore. You have a beautiful little ledger out here, and I'm sorry about what's going to happen to part of it, and I want you to know, I gave you every chance I could. Fire, the squadron commander said. 40 particle lances lit the dark. Orun saw them land. The englobement was textbook. The timing was perfect. The Concordance squadron had drilled this maneuver for centuries, and they executed it flawlessly. 40 bolts of focused particle fire converging on a single point from 40 angles at once. More than enough energy to gut a Concordance dreadnought twice over. All of it striking the scarred gray flank of the warship St. Aldridge in the same half-second. And the warship took it. That was all. It took it. The bolts struck the overlapping armor and bled away across it in sheets of harmless light, the way rain bleeds off a stone, and where they struck, they left new pale scars among the 10,000 old ones, and the warship did not slow, did not list, did not so much as adjust its heading. Orun's instruments, which had recorded the exact energy of 40 lances, recorded the exact energy absorbed by the hull, and the 2 numbers were the same, and the warship's flat dead power line did not move, because whatever was eating that much energy was not on any system the Great Index could see. The squadron fired again, and again. They poured everything they had into the single scarred hull, and the scarred hull drank it, and added the scars to its collection, and kept coming. The squadron commander did the only thing left to a creature who had never lost. He launched his interceptors, all 400 of them, the small fast craft the cutters carried for exactly this, and the swarm spread out and bored in toward the single scarred hull, weaving the close attack pattern that had broken 3 insurrections. Orun watched them go in. He watched them reach the warship, and he watched the warship do nothing to them at all. The interceptors strafed the hull, found nothing to bite, nothing to feel them, no shield to overload, and no engine to foul, and one by one they pulled away, out of ammunition and out of ideas, having scratched their pretty stripes across 4 kilometers of metal that had simply declined to notice. The commander recalled them. There was nothing else to do. The St. Aldridge had not so much as turned a battery toward them. Orun pulled the records of the 400 interceptor runs and studied them, while the squadron regrouped, because a clerk studied things, and what he found in them was the quiet horror under the loud one. The interceptor crews had done everything right. They had flown the pattern that had cracked open 3 insurgent flagships. They had found the seams a normal hull always had, the gaps between armor plates, the sensor blisters, the engine throats, the soft places every warship in the Index carried somewhere on its body. And the St. Aldridge had no soft places. There were no seams that led anywhere. There were no engine throats to foul, because there were no engines that gave off heat. There was nothing on the entire 4-kilometer hull that an attacker could reach in and break, and Orun realized that this was not luck, and it was not armor. It was design. Someone had built this ship across 4 centuries, specifically so that a swarm of small, clever craft, doing everything right, would find absolutely nothing to do. Overseer? Orun said. His voice did not sound like his own. It is not even firing back. It wasn't. That was the part the index hall could not process. The warship had unmade a freighter to warn them, had absorbed a squadron's full barrage without flinching, had let 400 interceptors exhaust themselves against its flank, and was now simply moving through the englobement, through the perfect tightening net of 40 cutters, the way a stone moves through smoke. Not attacking, not destroying, just passing, just leaving, just doing the thing it had said 3 times it wanted to do, which was to keep going through space that an ancient order had insisted on calling its own. And the squadron, which had never once in its history failed to compel a vessel, found that it could not even slow this one down. The commander's voice came again, and now the pride was gone, and only the trembling remained. Why won't it die? Hit the engines. Hit the bridge. Hit something. There is nothing to hit, Commander, Orun said quietly, though the commander could not hear him. The engines give no signature. The bridge does not show. You are firing at a thing the index cannot see. With weapons the thing cannot feel. Because we filed it as harmless, and it let us. Because it wanted us to learn this with the smallest possible cost. He realized, no longer just logging the event. He was understanding it. And understanding it was so much worse. The warship cleared the far edge of the englobement. 40 cutters, their lances spent and useless, hung in a broken sphere around empty space where their prisoner had been, and not one of them had a scratch, because the warship had not chosen to give them one. It could have. Orun had no doubt of that now. It had unmade a freighter without a flicker of output. It could have unmade 40 cutters in the same silent instant. It had chosen not to. It had absorbed everything they threw, given them their first true scar of fear, and let them live to file it. That was the courtesy. That had been the courtesy all along. The warship was not sparing them out of weakness. It was sparing them out of something the Great Index had no entry for, a thing Orun's people had filed under many smaller names over 11,000 years, and never once correctly. The restraint of a power so far beyond the thing in front of it, that killing was simply beneath the trouble. Saul found his voice at last. It was a small voice now. Clerk Orun, the overseer said, open a new entry. It is open, overseer. Set its threat tier. Orun looked at the tier bands. The lowest was for Rex. The highest, the one the index had used exactly 4 times in 11,000 years, was for things that ended civilizations. He looked at the warship St. Aldridge, scarred and patient and moving on, having absorbed a squadron and spared it in the same breath, and he understood that even the highest band was wrong, because the highest band was for things that wanted to end you, and this thing did not want anything from the concordance at all. It had been passing through. The whole catastrophe had unfolded only because an ancient order could not bear the existence of a thing it had not already written down. Overseer, Orun said, we do not have a tier for this. He looked at the warship's name, where he had copied its shape into the entry. St. Aldridge. He still did not know what a saint was. He was beginning to suspect it was a word for a thing that suffered everything and could not be made to break, and that the Terrans named their warships after such things on purpose, as a warning, and that the concordance, proud, ancient, patient, certain, had read that warning aloud in a formal demand, and never once understood a single word of it. On the feed, the warship that should not exist crossed the last of the outpost's catalogued space, unhurried, scarred, alive. And the Rim Defense Squadron, 40 proud cutters that had never lost, formed up behind it, at a careful and respectful distance, and did the one thing the Great Index had never recorded a concordance squadron doing in 11,000 years. They let it go. The recall order reached Orun 3 days later, and it came not from his overseer, but from the Hall of First Records itself, the deepest tier of the Great Index, where the oldest clerks kept the entries that no one was allowed to delete. He had never been summoned there. Almost no one was. He went down through tier after violet tier, past work shells that grew older and quieter as he descended, until the soft modern light gave way to the deep amber glow of the founding archive, and there, in a chamber whose walls held the original ledger of the concordance, an archivist of the first records was waiting for him, with the entry for Object 9 Null floating between them. The archivist was very old. Orun could not have guessed the count of its years. When it spoke, its voice was the dry whisper of a thing that had filed empires. You deleted a word, the archivist said. From a live entry. The word was harmless. Tell me why. Because it was wrong, Orun said. Many entries are wrong before they are right. We correct them. We do not leave a tier blank. The archivist's many-lidded eyes turned to the entry, to the empty space where a threat tier should have been. You told Overseer Saul that we do not have a tier for this thing. That is a serious claim, clerk. The tiers are not a convenience. They are the spine of the index. A thing that cannot be tiered is a thing that cannot be filed, and a thing that cannot be filed is a thing the concordance cannot survive, because the concordance has only ever survived one way. The dry whisper sharpened, by filing the loud ones before they grew. So I will ask you plainly, is the warship St. Aldridge a thing we can file? Orun was silent for a long moment. He had spent 3 days with the recordings. He had watched the freighter come apart 100 times. He had measured the energy the hull had drunk down to the joule. He had searched the great index, the memory of the settled galaxy, for any thread of the word Terran, and found nothing. No record, no record, no record. And somewhere in those 3 days, the fear had burned through and left behind something colder and clearer. No, he said, we cannot file it. And I think the reason is the most important entry I will ever write. Then write it for me now, aloud. So Orun told the oldest clerk in the concordance what he had come to understand. The index works, he began, because every power is small before it is large. We file the loud ones young. We watch the empires grow from the first survey drone, and by the time they could threaten us, we know them better than they know themselves, because we have their whole history in the ledger. That is our power. Not weapons, memory. We outweight everyone, because we remember everyone from the beginning. He looked at the entry, at the empty origin field, the empty class field, the empty registry. But the warship St. Aldridge has no beginning in our ledger. Not because it is new, because it grew up somewhere we were never watching. It is 412 years old, archivist. It told us so. It has been shot by a hive, by machine minds, by an entity older than this archive, and it filed none of them with us because it did not need us to remember its enemies. It remembered them itself, and it ended them itself. The archivist said nothing. Orun went on. We always thought an empty entry meant a thing was young and small. Overseer Saul said it himself, and he believed it, and so did I. But an empty entry does not mean young. It means unseen, and a thing that grew to 4 kilometers and 4 centuries entirely unseen by the Great Index is the one thing 11,000 years of doctrine never prepared us for. It is a power that did not need us to know it existed in order to become what it is. Everything we have ever caught, we caught because we were watching when it was weak. We were never watching this. By the time we saw it, it was already finished. It was already a saint. A saint, the archivist repeated. Their word. On the prow. I do not fully know what it means, but I have measured what it does. It means a thing that takes everything and does not break. The amber light flickered across the old clerk's face. For a long while it did not speak. Orun stood in the deep glow and looked at the founding ledger that ringed the chamber, the oldest writing the concordance possessed. Lines so ancient their script was a half-step from his own, and he thought about how the whole great edifice of his order rested on a single quiet assumption that he had watched die 3 days ago in the violet dark of the index hall. The assumption was this, that to be unseen was to be small, that a thing the ledger had not caught was a thing the ledger could still catch. He had believed it his whole life. So had every clerk who had ever lived. And it was wrong. And the proof of how wrong it was had crossed the rim with a dead reactor and a saint's name and absorbed 40 lances without bothering to fire back. When the archivist spoke again, its voice had changed, and the change frightened Orun more than the silence of the index hall had 3 days before. There is an entry, the archivist said, that you are not cleared to see. I am going to show it to you anyway, because you are the only clerk in 11,000 years who deleted the word harmless and was right to do it. It reached into the founding ledger, into the oldest amber depths, and drew out an entry so old, its script had faded almost to nothing. 42,000 years ago, before the concordance was the concordance, before we filed and instead merely fought, there was a war. We do not teach it. It is the reason we stopped fighting and started writing. We met a power we could not file, and we sent everything we had against it, ship for ship, and we learned a lesson that became the whole of our doctrine. Do you know what the lesson was? No, Orun said. The lesson was, never again meet a thing you cannot file with weapons. Meet it with the ledger instead. Catalog it. Surround it with knowledge. Find the line in its history where it was small. And wait. We have followed that lesson for 42,000 years, and it has never failed us. The archivist's faded eyes lifted. But the lesson assumes one thing, clerk. It assumes the thing has a line in its history where it was small, and that we can find it. The warship St. Aldridge has no line we can find. It grew up beyond the ledger, so our entire doctrine, the wisdom of 42,000 years, the spine of the concordance, has one crack in it, and that crack is shaped exactly like a Terran warship, and it has just walked through our rim and absorbed a squadron and forgiven us for it. Orun's hands had gone cold again. Then what do we do? That is the question the first records have summoned you to answer, because you are the only one of us who has looked at the thing without the comfort of believing we could catch it. The archivist drew itself up. And there is a complication. The warship did not come alone, Orun. It came as a courtesy too. I do not understand. Pull the deep-range survey. The one your outpost array is too small to read. We read it here, in the first records, where the long instruments are. Orun pulled the deep-range survey, and the third wrong thing he would see appeared in the amber air, and it was the worst of all of them. The warship St. Aldridge had not been the fleet, it had been the scout. Behind it, far out beyond the rim, beyond the gas giant, beyond the reach of any outpost array, the deep instruments of the first records had caught a signature, and the signature was not flat, and it was not dead, and it was not one ship. It was a wall. Orun's array could not have seen it. The first records could barely hold it. A formation of warships, all of them the same brutal scarred slab-sided make as the St. Aldridge, all of them 4 kilometers and more, all of them holding station in a vast disciplined line that stretched across more space than the entire Threll Concordance administered. Orun's training reached automatically for the count, because counting was what he did, because a thing without a number was a thing he could not hold in his mind, and the first records gave him the number, and the number was the last entry his old confidence would ever survive. 2,106. 2,106 warships, every one of which could absorb a squadron and unmake a freighter without showing a single joule of output, holding a perfect line beyond the rim, having sent one scarred saint ahead to read the Concordance's mail and find out, gently, with the smallest possible cost, whether the ancient order would be reasonable or whether it would need to be taught. Orun looked at the count for a long time. He had logged the Vesh war fleet, 14,000 hulls, and filed it in an afternoon, and the filing had felt like power. He understood now that it had been nothing of the kind. 14,000 Vesh hulls were 14,000 things the index could see, measure, predict, and outweight. They had a beginning in the ledger. They had been small once. The Concordance had watched them grow, and had filed them with the calm certainty of a thing that already knew how the story ended. 2,106 Terran hulls were a different category of fact entirely. Not one of them had a beginning the index could find. Not one of them could be measured by the instruments that had measured everything. They were a fleet the ledger could not hold, and a ledger that could not hold a fleet was, for the first time in 42,000 years, just paper. They call it the Long Watch, the archivist said quietly. We intercepted the term in the warship's transmissions. The Terran Reach maintains a standing formation that simply watches the dark, 400 years and counting, and when something disturbs the spaces they care about, they send one ship ahead to ask politely, and if the asking goes badly, the Long Watch comes. The old clerk's faded eyes turned to Orun. We fired on the one they sent ahead, clerk, 40 cutters. We refused its courtesy 3 times and we fired on it. By every doctrine the Concordance has, by every entry in this archive, the Long Watch should already be moving. Orun looked at the wall of warships in the amber air, 2,106 scarred slabs holding their patient line, and he understood that the Great Index had spent 11,000 years learning to file the loud powers while they were small, and had never once imagined a power that grew up entirely in silence, watching the dark, getting ready, forgiving the small for as long as the small allowed itself to be forgiven. "Is it moving?" Orun asked. His voice was a thread. The archivist looked at the deep-range survey for a long, long time. "Not yet," it said. The St. Aldridge transmitted something to them, after the squadron let it pass. We could not read all of it. But one phrase was in the trade tongue, plainly, as if it wanted us to catch it. "Do you want to know what the warship told its fleet about us, Clerk Orun? After we mocked it, and fined it, and fired on it 40 times? Orun did not want to know. He had to know. It was the deepest discipline of his order, older than the tiers, older than the founding ledger. A clerk had to know. "Tell me," he said. The archivist's dry whisper filled the amber dark of the founding archive, and it was the line that would be carved, one day, into the wall of the first records, the line that ended 11,000 years of certainty and began whatever came after. It told them, the archivist said, to stand down. It told the Long Watch that the Concordance was old and proud and frightened, and that frightened things lash out, and that the deaths of 40 cutter crews would mean nothing to a fleet that had buried whole species. And then it said the part we are not built to survive. It said, leave them their ledger, let them write down what they saw. That ledger is the only weapon they have, and one day, a wiser clerk than the ones who fired on me will read the entry, and understand, and the Concordance will live because of it. Do not take that from them. Let them remember us correctly. That will be punishment enough. There is more, the archivist said. Listen to a fragment we did read. The St. Aldridge transmits constantly, in the open, on a low band, and most of it is not orders and not threats. It is names. Listen. The amber air filled with the warship's calm level voice, reading a list. It read names, one after another, slow and even, each followed by a place and a date the index could not place. There were hundreds of them, then thousands. The voice did not hurry, and it did not stop. And Orun understood, listening, that he was hearing a roll of the dead, the crews of every ship that had ever stood the watch and not come back, read aloud across 4 centuries, so that the living ships would never forget what the watch cost. The Concordance kept a ledger of everything that existed. The Terrans kept a ledger of everyone who had died so that others could exist, and they broadcast it, in the open, where anyone could hear, because to them, a name unspoken was a kind of second death. They count too, Orun said quietly, like us. But they do not count to file, they count to remember. Yes, the archivist said, and that, clerk, is the difference between an order that has survived for 11,000 years and a people who deserve to. We learned to count so that nothing could surprise us. They learned to count so that nothing would be forgotten. One of those is a fortress. The other is a reason to hold the line. We built the fortress. We never found the reason. And a 400-year-old ship just crossed our rim, carrying both. Orun stood in the deep amber light of the oldest archive in the settled galaxy, and he understood that he was the clerk the warship had meant. He was the entry it had spared the Concordance to write. The understanding did not make him proud. It made him afraid in a new and quieter way, because it meant the survival of his entire people now rested on whether a single clerk could write a thing down honestly enough that the proud creatures above him would believe it before they did something that could not be forgiven a second time. He had deleted one word and been right. He would have to be right about every word from now on. He turned back to the floating entry for Object 9 Null, the one he had nearly labeled harmless, and he began, with steady hands now, to write the truth of it down. Not to catch the Terrans, not to file them small, but to remember them correctly, because a scarred saint 400 years old had crossed the rim and decided that the Concordance's last and only weapon was its memory, and had chosen, out of a mercy older than the index, to let them keep it. Overseer Saul did not believe in the Long Watch, and he made his disbelief into an order before Orun could stop him. The order reached the rim outpost as Orun was climbing back up from the first records, and by the time he reached the index hall, it was already half done. Saul had spent 3 days being afraid in front of his clerks, and a proud creature cannot bear that for long. And so he had reached past his fear for the one thing that had always made the Concordance feel large again, the ledger, and the certainty that came with it. He had decided that the wall beyond the rim could not be 2,000 warships, because 2,000 warships of that make was an impossibility the index could not hold. and a thing the index could not hold was, by 11,000 years of doctrine, a thing that was not real. He had decided it was a bluff, a projection, a trick of empty hulls and false signatures, meant to frighten an old order into surrendering catalogued space. And he had ordered the Rim's long lance, the outpost's single heavy weapon, the gun that could crack a moon, to fire a ranging shot at the formation beyond the Rim, to call the bluff and prove the wall was hollow. "Overseer, stop the shot," Orun said, the moment he reached the hall. The first records confirmed it. 2,106 hulls. It is not a projection. They are real, and they are holding, and they were ordered to stand down, and if you fire on them, you take that order away. "The first records are old and frightened, like everything down there," Saul said. He did not turn from the firing shell. "I am not going to lose this outpost to a ghost story, clerk. I am going to fire one ranging shot at empty space, and when it passes through their projection and hits nothing, this hall will remember what we are. We are the index. We do not kneel to a bluff." "It is not a bluff," Orun said. "The warship spared us. It told its fleet to spare us. You are about to fire on a mercy, Overseer. There is no entry for what comes after that." For a moment, Orun thought he had reached him. Saul's hand paused above the firing shell, and the Overseer looked, just once, at the great display where the deep-range survey burned, where the wall held its patient line, where the count stood in clean violet script. And Orun saw the war inside him. He saw the part of Saul that had stood in the index hall 3 days ago and watched a squadron's whole barrage bleed off a scarred hull, the part that knew, in its body, that the thing beyond the Rim was real, and was patient, and was holding back. And he saw the other part, the older part, the part that was 11,000 years deep and could not, would not, must not ever say the words "I was wrong," out loud in front of its clerks. Orun watched the older part win. He had time to understand that it would win, and no time at all to stop it. Saul fired the long lance. Orun watched the shot go. The Rim's heavy gun threw a single lance of focused fire out past the gas giant, out across the dark toward the patient wall, a shot that could crack a moon, a shot the Concordance had fired exactly once before in its history, and it crossed the void in a long bright line, and it did not pass through empty space, and it did not hit nothing. It struck the formation. Specifically, it struck one ship at the near edge of the wall, one scarred slab among 2,000, and Orun's array, which had recorded the freighter's death to the gram, and the squadron's barrage to the jewel, recorded the long lance striking the Terran hull, and recorded the energy bleeding away across the overlapping armor in sheets of harmless light, exactly the way it had bled off the St. Aldridge, leaving one more pale scar among 10,000, and the struck ship did not so much as alter its station. The wall was real. The shot proved it. And now the wall had been fired upon. For 9 seconds, nothing. Orun counted them, because he always counted, and these were the longest 9 seconds of his 400 years. He stood in the index hall with 200 clerks and an overseer who had just fired a mooncracker at a mercy, and he counted the seconds, and in each one he thought of the 40 cutter crews who were still alive, and of the worlds the Concordance administered, and of the simple fact that everything those things were worth now hung on whether a fleet that had been told to forgive could be made to forgive twice. Orun would remember, for the rest of his life, the exact shape of that silence. 200 clerks, an overseer with his hand near a firing shell, and a fleet of 2,106 waiting on a single answer. He had spent 400 years believing the index was the patient one, the one that outweighted everything, and only now, in the longest pause of his life, did he understand that the Terrans had outweighted them at their own craft. The warship had waited 11 seconds for the first hail. It had waited 9 for each demand. It had waited 3 full days while the Concordance argued with itself. It had waited, in the end, for one clerk to read a name correctly, and it had been willing to wait for the cost of an entire outpost, rather than take that reading away by force. The Concordance prided itself on patience. It had just met patience with a hull 4 kilometers long, and it had nearly mistaken that patience for weakness, the way it had mistaken everything about the St. Aldridge for weakness, right up until the freighter turned to dust. Then the warship St. Aldridge spoke again, and it was the same calm, level voice, and that calm was now the most terrible sound Orun had ever heard, because he understood what it was costing. That was a heavy shot, the warship said. Mooncracker, you meant it. I told my fleet you were frightened, and I asked them to forgive you one squadron, because frightened things lash out, and I've forgiven a lot of frightened things. But that wasn't a panicked cutter crew. That was a deliberate order, from your command, at my fleet, after I extended every courtesy a ship can extend. So I have to ask the question I was hoping not to ask. Is that your answer? Do you want the Long Watch to consider you a threat? Because I can still call it back. Once. Tell me now. The Index Hall stared at Overseer Saul, and Orin watched the oldest weakness of his people rise up in the Overseer's face. Not cruelty, not even pride, but the simple inability of an ancient and certain order to say the words, "I was wrong," out loud, in front of its clerks, to a thing that was not in its files. Saul had fired to prove the wall was hollow. The wall was not hollow, and now the only way to save the outpost was to admit, on the open band, that the Great Index had been wrong about something, and 42,000 years of doctrine had built Saul too well for that. "It is asking us to surrender," Saul said, to the hall, his voice climbing. "It struck our property. It absorbed our squadron, and now it asks the Concordance to kneel and call itself a threat in its own catalogued space. I will not. We are the Index." He turned to the firing shell. "Full battery. Every gun on the rim. If the wall is real, then we will be the entry that records the Concordance fighting, and we will—" "Overseer," Orun said, and his voice cut across the hall with a clarity that surprised even him. "Look at the entry." He had pulled it up on the great display, the entry for Object 9 Null, the one he had written in the first records, the truth of the warship. And beneath it, because the long instruments of the founding archive were tied now to his shell, he had pulled the deep-range survey, the wall, the 2,106 hulls, and Orun did the one thing a clerk could do, the only weapon his order had ever truly possessed. He made them see it. He put the count on the display where every clerk in the hall could read it. He put the recordings beside it. The freighter coming apart with no output, the squadron's full barrage bleeding away to nothing, the mooncracker lance leaving a single scar on a hull 4 kilometers long. He put the warship's 3 refused courtesies in plain violet script. And then he put up the line the archivist had given him, the line the warship had transmitted to its fleet, the mercy that had spared them. "Leave them their ledger. Let them remember us correctly. That will be punishment enough." "Read it," Orun said to the hall. "All of you. You are clerks of the Great Index. You spend your lives recording what is true. So record this, right now, in front of the Overseer, because it is the truest thing the Index has filed in 11,000 years. We are not large. We were never large. We survived by being the first to write down the loud ones, and we mistook that for power. The thing beyond the rim grew up where we were not watching, and it could end this outpost, and the next, and every world the Concordance administers, in less time than it would take me to log it. And it has chosen not to. It has chosen, twice now, to spare us. The Overseer wants to fire the full battery and call that bravery. I am telling you, as the clerk who deleted the word harmless and was right, that firing the full battery is not bravery. It is the last entry the Concordance will ever write, and no one will be left to read it. The hall was silent. 200 clerks looked at the count on the display, 2,106, and at the freighter coming apart, and at the mooncracker scar that meant nothing, and at the line of mercy in plain violet script. And Orun watched 11,000 years of certainty meet, all at once, in 200 minds, a thing it could not file. And the clerks did what clerks do. They believed the record. It was the one thing they had been built, across 100 lifetimes of training, to do above all else. To trust the ledger over the voice of authority, because the ledger did not flatter, and the ledger did not fear, and the ledger had outlived 9 empires, precisely because it was the one thing in the Concordance that could not be ordered to lie. Orun had given them a record, and a clerk who is shown a true record cannot unsee it, no matter who is standing over the firing shell. The senior communications clerk, the one who had hesitated before, reached past the Overseer's authority, a thing that had never happened in the Index, a thing there was no entry for, and opened the band to the warship, and said, in a voice that shook but did not stop, "This is the Threll Concordance. The shot was an error of command, not an answer. We see your count. We have recorded it correctly. We do not consider you a threat, and we ask you not to consider us one. Please, call it back." Overseer Saul turned, and for a moment, Orun thought he would countermand it, would override the clerk, would fire the full battery out of pure inability to be wrong. The overseer's hand hovered over the firing shell. His pale face worked. Around him, 200 clerks watched, and not one of them moved to help him, and Orun understood that this was the loneliest moment any overseer of the Concordance had ever faced, the moment when his own order, the order built to obey the record, chose the record over him. And then Saul looked at the great display, at the count, 2,106, at the single scar on a hull that had drunk a mooncracker, and Orun watched the oldest creature in the hall finally understand the thing the warship had understood from the first hail, that the Concordance's only weapon had never been its guns, and that the clerk it had spent 4 days dismissing had just used that weapon, the ledger, the truth, the count, to do what 40 cutters and a mooncracker could not. He had stopped the war. Saul's hand came away from the firing shell. He did not say I was wrong. He could not. He was built too well for that. But he turned to Orun, and he said the thing that, in the language of the index, meant the same. "Clerk Orun," the overseer said, very quietly, "take the entry. It is yours now. Tear it however you must." The warship St. Aldridge was silent for a long moment. When it answered, for the first time, the calm in its voice had changed again, and this time, the thing underneath it was not regret, and it was not warning. It was something close to respect. "Calling it back," the warship said. "The long watch will hold its line, and then it will move off, the way it came, and you will likely never see it again. You got there in the end. That's more than most do." A pause. "There's a clerk in there who deleted a word. I don't know your name, and I won't ask it. But you should know that the ship that nearly cracked your outpost is named for a man who took everything they could throw at him and never once broke, and never once struck back when he didn't have to. And the reason we name our warships after men like that is so that the people we meet will understand what we are, before it costs them anything. You understood. You read the name right. Most don't until the very end." On the deep-range survey, the wall began to move. 2,106 scarred slabs, holding their perfect line, came about as one, smooth and silent and unhurried, and began to withdraw into the dark from which they had watched. 400 years and counting, the patient guardians of spaces the Concordance had never known were watched at all. And the warship St. Aldridge, the scout, the saint, the thing the great index had nearly filed as harmless, turned its scarred prow toward the receding wall, and lit no engine that Orun's array could see, and crossed 900 kilometers in a single silent breath, and was gone. Orun stood before the great display in the quiet of the index hall, surrounded by 200 clerks who had just watched their certainty die and their outpost live, and he looked at the entry for Object 9 null, the empty origin, the empty class, the empty registry, the count of 2,106, and the name he had copied in a shaking hand 4 days before, and he reached out, with steady hands now, to set the threat tier at last. He did not set it to the highest band. The highest band was for things that wanted to end you. He set it to a band that had never existed before, a band he created in that moment, with the full and astonished authority the overseer had just handed him, and he gave it a name that the great index would carry for the rest of its long, patient, newly humbled life. He named the band Spared. The new tier did not stay quiet, and that was how Orun learned the warship had given him more than a mercy. It had given him a test, and the Concordance was about to take it. 11 days after the Long Watch withdrew, a second contact crossed the rim, and it was not Terran. Orun was at his work shell when the array woke. He had not slept well since the founding archive. The count of 2,106 lived behind his eyes now, and so did the line of mercy, and so did the new word he had carved into the spine of the index. When the array brightened with a fresh contact, he felt the old cold crawl up the back of his neck, and for one terrible moment he thought the wall had come back. It had not. This was something else, and it was loud in every way the St. Aldridge had been silent. The contact lit Orun's array like a wound. A drive signature so bright it whited out 3 of his instruments. A power curve that climbed and did not stop. And behind the lead signature, more of them. A swarm. A tide. hulls without number flooding through the rim in a screaming rush, and the array struggled to count them, and then gave up, and simply reported the shape of the thing, and the shape was a fist. "Overseer," Orun said, and Saul was already there, because Saul did not leave the index hall anymore. The overseer had not been the same since the day he took his hand off the firing shell. He was quieter. He listened now. It had cost him something to learn the lesson, and he had paid it. And he stood beside Orun's shell, looking at the bright screaming tide pouring through the rim, and he said, in his quiet new voice, "Who are they?" Orun cross-referenced. This time, the Great Index answered. This contact had a record. It had a long and terrible record, and Orun read it aloud as it scrolled. "The Karzon Hive," he said. "They are in the founding ledger. They burn through settled space every few centuries, strip it, and move on. The Concordance has filed 3 of their migrations. We survived them by hiding, by emptying the worlds in their path, and waiting for them to pass. We have never stopped one. We have never had anything that could." He looked up. "There are 4,000 hulls in that tide, Overseer, and they are heading for the inner worlds, and there is nothing on the rim that can slow them. By doctrine, we should already be evacuating." And then Orun stopped, because a memory had surfaced. A recording he had watched 100 times in the founding archive. A calm, level voice listing the things that had shot at it across 4 centuries. By the Karzon Hive, by the Velt machine mines, by 3 separate species that thought their numbers would matter. None of them are filing reports anymore. The Karzon Hive. The Warship had named them. The St. Aldridge had been shot by this exact tide, somewhere out in the dark beyond the ledger. And the Warship was still here, and the Hive was screaming through the rim, like it had never been touched, and Orun understood, with a jolt that was half terror and half something he could not name, that the 2 facts could not both be casual. "Overseer," he said slowly. "The Terrans know this Hive. The St. Aldridge fought it, and the Long Watch was holding a line, 400 years, beyond our rim, watching the dark." He turned to the deep-range survey, the one tied to the founding archive, and he pulled it with hands that had learned to be steady. What were they watching for? The deep instruments answered. Beyond the rim, beyond the screaming tide of the Karzon Hive, beyond the place where 2,106 scarred slabs had withdrawn 11 days ago, the wall was there again. It had not gone home. It had never gone home. It had withdrawn from the Concordance's catalogued space the way a guardian steps back from a doorway, and it had taken up its line again, exactly where it always was. In the long dark the Terrans had been watching for 400 years, and the thing it had been watching for was not the Concordance at all. It was the Hive. The Long Watch was not aimed at the Threll. It had never been aimed at the Threll. The Terrans maintained a standing wall of warships across the spaces the Hive migrated through, 4 centuries and counting, so that when the tide came screaming out of the dark toward worlds full of people who had hidden from it for 11,000 years, there would be something standing in the way. And the St. Aldridge had crossed the rim 11 days ago, not to threaten the Concordance, but to find out, quietly, with the smallest possible cost, whether the order living behind that wall was worth standing in front of. Orun sat with that for one long moment. He thought of the demand the Concordance had sent the warship, that it was a clerical irregularity, that it must power down, that it was being fined. He thought of the 40 lances and the mooncracker. The Terrans had come to find out whether the Threll were worth defending, and the Threll had answered by mocking them, fining them, and shooting at them, and the Terrans had decided to defend them anyway. There was no entry in the Great Index for a mercy that large. Orun was about to watch them prove it. "They are going to fight it," Saul whispered. 2,000 against 4,000. They are going to lose. "No," Orun said. He had measured what one of those hulls could do. He had recorded a freighter coming apart with no output, and a squadron's barrage bleeding to nothing, and a mooncracker leaving a single scar. He had spent 4 days learning what the word saint meant. "No, Overseer, watch. We are about to file something the Concordance has waited 42,000 years to see. We are about to record what one of these things does when it is not being polite." The 2 formations met beyond the rim, and Orun's array, and the deep instruments of the founding archive, and every clerk in the index hall, recorded all of it. The Hive came screaming in, 4,000 hulls in a fist, The way it had broken every defense the settled galaxy had ever raised against it. Certain in the way the concordance had once been certain. Certain that numbers were the answer. That no wall could hold against a tide. The Karzon had never met a thing it could not file under prey. It had a record of everyone. It had burned everyone. It did not have a record of the Terran Reach. The wall did not break. The wall did not even bend. The scarred slabs held their line, and the hive crashed against it. And Orun watched, on every instrument he had, the thing the St. Aldridge had done to one freighter, happened to 4,000 hulls at once. There was no flash. There was no charging curve. There was the flat dead silence of a power that gave off no signature. And where the silence touched the hive came apart. Not exploded, came apart. Hull by hull by hull, the screaming tide unmade itself against the scarred wall, peeling into slow expanding clouds of fragments finer than a clerk's hand, 4,000 of them. In a span of minutes, Orun would count and recount for the rest of his life, because no one would believe the number without the count. The Karzon hive, the terror of 11,000 years, the tide the concordance had only ever survived by hiding, broke against the Long Watch like water against stone, and the Long Watch did not lose a single hull. Not one. Orun checked. He checked 4 times. 2,106 scarred slabs went into the meeting of fleets, and 2,106 scarred slabs came out, each carrying a few new pale scars among 10,000 old ones, and the hive that had burned the settled galaxy since before the concordance kept records was a glittering haze drifting outward in a perfect expanding sphere, every piece smaller than a hand. The index hall was silent. 200 clerks watched the haze drift, and not one of them could speak, because the thing they had just filed broke the spine of their entire understanding. The concordance had spent 42,000 years believing that the loud powers always destroyed themselves, that patience always outlasted strength, that the ledger was the only true weapon. And they had just watched a power that grew up unseen, that never asked to be filed, that maintained a standing wall across the dark out of a logic the index had no entry for, end in minutes the thing the concordance had fled from for all of recorded time. For the first time in his 400 years, Orun thought of the inner worlds, the quiet catalogued worlds full of clerks and farmers and children who had spent 11,000 years believing the concordance kept them safe by writing things down. They had been wrong. The ledger had never kept them safe from the hive. It had only told them, in advance and in exact detail, how the next burning would go. The thing that had actually kept the inner worlds alive this time was a wall they had never seen, kept by a people they had found, in a dark they had never thought to look at. He filed that too. He filed it carefully. It was the truest line in the entry, and the hardest. And then the warship St. Aldridge spoke one last time, on the open band, in the calm level voice that Orun would hear in his quiet moments for the rest of his life. That's what was coming, the warship said. We've been standing in front of it for 400 years, since the first time it burned a world we cared about, and we never told you, because telling you would have meant you'd build walls of your own, and your walls would have been small, and small walls just give a tide more wreckage to throw. So we stood the watch, and let you keep your ledger, and your peace, and your idea that you were the patient ones who outlasted everything. You were never going to outlast that. You were going to hide from it for the 4th time, and lose a few more worlds and call it survival. We decided we'd rather you didn't. Saul, the overseer who had nearly fired a full battery at the wall, who had spent 400 years certain the index was large, stood very still and said nothing. Your clerk asked the right question, the warship went on. What were we watching for? Nobody asks that. Everybody asks what we are, or where we came from, or why our hulls are dirty. Your clerk asked what we were watching for, and that's the only question that ever mattered, because it's the question that tells you we were never watching you. We were watching the thing that was going to kill you. There's a difference between a power that has come for you and a power that has come to stand between you and the dark, and almost nobody alive can tell them apart until it's too late. Your clerk could. Remember that, when you write this down. Remember that the one who saved you was the one who stopped asking what we were, and asked what we were facing. And then, because it was a Terran warship, and it had a long way still to go, it said the last thing, and it said it kindly. We'll move the watch out past your rim now, where you won't have to see it. You'll forget we were here, In a few centuries. That's all right. The watch isn't kept to be remembered. Keep your ledger, Threll. Keep it honest. It's a good weapon, in its way. Just remember it was never the only one, and it was never the biggest. And the day you thought it was, a dirty 400-year-old ship with a dead reactor and a saint's name crossed your rim and let you find that out for the cost of one empty freighter. We could have taught it to you for the cost of everything. We chose the freighter. Don't make the next ship choose differently. The deep-range survey showed the Long Watch coming about one final time, 2,106 scarred slabs in a perfect disciplined line, and they withdrew past the rim into the long dark, into the spaces they had watched for 4 centuries, and would watch for centuries more. And the warship St. Aldridge, the Scout, the Saint, the thing that had nearly been filed as harmless, took its place at the near edge of the line, and the whole wall lit no engines that any instrument in the concordance could see, and crossed the dark in a single silent breath, and was gone. Orun sat at his workshell in the quiet of the index hall for a long time after that. The other clerks drifted back to their tiers, slowly, the way creatures move when their whole understanding of themselves has been rebuilt in an afternoon. Saul stood beside him for a while, and then went down, alone, to the first records, to tell the oldest clerk in the concordance what its long instruments had already shown it. He did not speak to Orun before he went. He only rested one hand, briefly, on the edge of the clerk's workshell, which was as close as an overseer of the index could come to saying thank you, and then he was gone down into the amber dark, a smaller creature than he had been 11 days ago, and a wiser one. And Orun did the only thing he had ever truly known how to do. He opened the entry for Object 9 Null, the one he had nearly labeled harmless, the one he had tiered as spared, and he wrote the truth of it down, all of it, the freighter, and the squadron, and the mooncracker, and the count, and the hive, and the wall, and the 4 centuries of a watch that had never once asked to be thanked. He wrote it cleanly and exactly, in the calm violet script of his order, because that was his discipline, and because a saint 400 years old had crossed the rim and decided that the concordance's memory was a thing worth saving, and had paid for the saving with the patient mercy of a power that could have done anything, and chose to do almost nothing. He wrote, at the end of the entry, the count that mattered most. Not 2,106, not 4,000. He wrote, the count of concordance crews lost on the day they met the warship that should not exist, the day they mocked it and fined it and fired on it 40 times, and then fired a mooncracker at its fleet. 0. That was the number the St. Aldridge had insisted on. Across 4 days and 3 refused courtesies, and a mooncracker shot, and the breaking of a hive, the Terrans had killed exactly none of them. They had unmade one empty freighter, to teach, and they had let a squadron live, and they had spared an outpost run by an order too proud to admit it was wrong, and they had stood between the concordance and a tide that would have burned it, and the price of all of it, the entire price, had been one dead hull no one would miss. Orun looked at the empty origin field, the empty class field, the empty registry, and he understood, at last, why the Great Index had never had a record of them. The Index filed the loud ones young, the ones that announced themselves, the ones that grew where it could watch. The Terran Reach had never announced itself to anyone. It had grown up in the dark, watching, getting ready, standing the long watch, and it had stayed unseen on purpose, because a power that wants to be feared makes noise, and a power that only wants to stand between the small and the dark makes none. The category error had never been that the warship was too big, or too fast, or too armed, though it was all of those. The category error was simpler than that, and the Great Index had been 42,000 years learning to make it. The concordance had spent its whole long life filing powers by the question, what do they want from us? It had no tier for a power that wanted nothing from them at all, that had crossed the rim not to take and not to threaten, but only to find out whether the small thing behind the wall was worth standing in front of, and had decided, despite everything, that it was. Orun finished the entry. He set the tier to spared, and then he did the last thing, the thing no clerk of the Great Index had done in 11,000 years, the thing that would mark his entry as the most read line in the founding archive for as long as the concordance kept records. He added a second name to the band, beneath spared, in the calm violet script, in the place reserved for what an entry had taught, He wrote the lesson the warship had given them, for the cost of one empty freighter. The lesson the proudest order in the settled galaxy had needed 400 years, and a screaming hive, and a dirty saint to learn. He wrote, "Not every wall in the dark is built against you, and the one you fire on first is the one that was holding the line." Word of the day spread through the concordance, the only way anything ever had, as an entry, read by clerk after clerk down the long tiers, copied out to every outpost and every inner world, the count and the courtesies and the zero and the lesson at the end. Orun heard, later, that on 3 separate worlds the clerks who read it stopped at the line about the wall and sat for a while without writing anything at all, which for clerks of the Great Index was the loudest possible response. The entry could not be deleted. The first records saw to that. It would outlive Orun and Sol and the outpost itself, the way the founding ledger had outlived the war that made it. A single true line passed down through a patient order that had finally learned the one thing 11,000 years of filing had never taught it, that, being remembered correctly by the small, is the only payment a guardian in the dark ever asks, and the only one worth giving. And far out beyond the rim, in the long dark the concordance would soon forget it had ever seen, 2,106 scarred slabs held their patient line against the next thing coming, the way they had for 400 years, the way they would for 400 more, asking nothing, announcing nothing, the saints of a power that had never once needed the galaxy to know its name, only needed the galaxy to be there, on the far side of the watch, still alive, when the dark sent its next tide screaming in.